Hello everyone, good afternoon everyone, wherever you are now. My name is Olena Carbou from Ukrainian think tank Liaison office in Brussels. And today, together with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, we have prepared an excellent webinar on disinformation against Ukraine and the European Union in times of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the last years, European Union and Ukraine have been on the front line on disinformation war, have been attacked massively in disinformation and interferes into internal affairs. And what has changed with the COVID-19 and how we are fighting back in these new realities. And before we answer this and other question, I give the floor to our partner, a representative from Friedrich Naumann Foundation, Thomas Ilka.
Yes, hello, thank you so much, Olena. Warm welcome, everyone out there. The Friedrich Naumann Foundation, which I am representing today, is working for a world of freedom. In over 60 countries around the world, we are active. We advocate for social market economy, open societies, and human rights. And so, of course, freedom of speech based on sound information and the fight against disinformation is very much at our heart. We know that Ukraine, both Ukraine and the European Union is and has been one of the battlegrounds of this disinformation war, and it all turned more intense with COVID-19. And so I'm very happy that we have such distinguished people which we can elaborate with on the subject. And I wish us all many insights and good information, good discussion for today. Thanks a lot on behalf of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. So back to you, Olena.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you. And I would outline the structure of our today's discussion. And we have built our event today on a very simple basis: action and counteraction. What has changed in the COVID-19 in terms of infodemia, as now called disinformation in times of pandemic? What are the new narratives? What are the new techniques? What are the new actors have appeared in disinformation landscape? And how do we all fight back on international level, national level, as communities, media, expert communities, civil society, companies? How can we learn from each other in order to be more efficient and effective? And to answer this, to tackle these issues, we have brought an excellent panel, and I will now introduce you all. Yes. So, this is my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. Jurgis Vilcinskas, Strategic Communication Division from European External Action Service. Jurgis, nice to hear you. Volodymyr Yermolenko from Internews Ukraine, one of the think tanks, and provide an analysis on disinformation. Welcome you, Volodymyr. Tanel Tang, Support Group for Ukraine, European Commission. Veronika Víchová, from European Values Center for Security Policy from Czech Republic. Nice to have you as well. And Nadiia Romanenko from Text UA, who is also representing one of the think tanks from Ukraine. So before I give the floor to our first panelist, I would just repeat our simple rules for today's discussion to smooth the exchange of views today. So first of all, if you have any question to the panelists, and we encourage you to have one, please write it in the Q&A window. If you want to put it towards a particular panelist, please indicate so. And I would like to ask you to be brief and concise so that we can take as many questions as time allows, and we will do it in the end. And as I already said, with all technical issues, please write in the chat window, which you all have in the bottom of your screens if you look from the computer, and also the same, or from your mobile phones. So without any further ado, we will start, and I give now the floor to Volodymyr Yermolenko to set up the stage from the Ukraine in terms of action. What do we see? How do you assess these changes which COVID-19 has brought into Ukrainian landscape of information and disinformation. Volodymyr, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Olena. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak on behalf of Internews Ukraine and our project Ukraine World, ukraineworld.org. Basically, we are in 2020, and 2020 is not 2018, so the situation is changing very much in Ukraine, not on the level of only on the level of virus, but also on the political level. I would say that Ukraine is now living through a kind of a period of slight revanchism when the previous actors, pre-Euromaidan actors, are getting stronger and stronger. And they're also launching a huge disinformation campaign. We're monitoring it in Internews Ukraine. We are now publishing weekly digests of anti-Western, anti-democracy messages. You can check them on our website, ukraineworld.org. There is a bunch of actors behind it. There are Russian actors, there are pro-Russian actors. For example, Mr. Medvedchuk, who is buying more and more TV channels, who is now controlling probably up to 50% of Ukrainian news TV channels. He has 3 and buying now a 4th one. We have former party of regions, like people like Olena Lukash or Andriy Portnov, who are also very active. And we have pro-Kolomoisky people, loyal to oligarch Kolomoisky, who are basically also saying all the time that the West is robbing Ukraine and that IMF is robbing Ukraine, etc. They're using the whole bunch of information channels, and it's getting more and more aggressive, more and more reach with hate speech. And there is a clear trend that they want to make a U-turn, a geopolitical U-turn of Ukraine. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. Now, how they're using the pandemic, of course, they used it as a tool for their purposes, and there are lots of new narratives coming out, but they're generally, I would say, the variations of the previous narratives used by these actors, saying that Ukraine is a failed state, or the West wants to buy Ukraine or to rob Ukraine. I would mention only a few of them. The first is that the West developed the virus to achieve its goals. There are lots of narratives, especially of pro-Russian actors and junk websites, that US is basically using, the United States is using it against its own population, against the blacks or Muslims. We have narratives like that. Then there is a whole network of narratives that United States have developed biological laboratories in Ukraine, in Georgia, and other states, and this becomes very widespread due to Mr. Medvedchuk himself. I can remind that Mr. Medvedchuk is the closest ally of Putin in Ukraine. We can now look at the slide that we prepared, Olena, if you can just bring it. We can see that one of the narratives developed by Mr. Medvedchuk is that again, Americans developed the whole, this one, the whole laboratory for human pathogens and experiments on humans. And this was not only, and this is a message voiced on major Medvedchuk TV channels like 112 or News One. Again, Ukraine is not the only target. For example, Georgia is another target. Another message concerns the WHO, so the World Health Organization, and there are messages like Bill Gates is behind it, that coronavirus doesn't exist or is not really dangerous, and there are much deeper concerns, much deeper interest behind it, and that basically Bill Gates is interested in developing a vaccine, right? Against it. Another message is very important, is geopolitical, and I would call it the end of liberalism, the end of American world order. And there are many messages saying that liberal democracy was not able to cope with the virus, and that coronavirus stops America's supremacy in the international arena, but also the EU role. I will turn to the EU a little bit later. The second big narrative is basically coming not only from Russians, but as I said, from people around Kolomoisky and others. One of the key messages is what we call the Sorosiata message. It's turned against George Soros, but under George Soros, there is a huge metaphor of the West itself. We can look at, for example, Mr. Portnov's message, the next slide. Portnov was a close ally of Yanukovych, that Soros Foundation is dictating the politics in Ukraine, whereas the trend is reverse, I would say. And we can also see another slide in which Mr. Azarov, the former prime minister under Yanukovych, is saying that all these pro-Western reforms are a genocide against Ukrainians. The one little thing about the EU is that the EU is widely criticized for using the pandemic to get rid of Ukrainian migrant workers, and did not show any solidarity with Ukraine. So EU is one of the key targets as well. And the final message, the final narrative is related to Russian Church. And the key message is that basically the coronavirus, Russian Church is a very conservative church in Ukraine. The key message is the coronavirus is a punishment for our sins, and that Ukraine is trying to get rid of Russian Church. So this is a brief overview. I saw already that the time is running out. This is a brief overview for your thoughts, and I hope we will come back to many things during the discussion. Thanks so much.
Olena, you are muted.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. So thank you, Volodymyr, for outlining this new realities from Ukrainian perspective, especially this anti-Western rhetorics. So Jurgis, now I will pass the floor to you. And also, can you from the European Union side see what is your assessment of the recent monitor of what has changed in the information disinformation? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olena, and all the best greetings from sunny Brussels. Great to join this webinar. Indeed, I'll try also to make my 5-minute pitch a little bit what we see in terms of COVID-related disinformation. And indeed, the virus is a big game changer, I think, in 2 ways. I mean, in one way, you've already mentioned it triggered quite an infodemic. So you don't see, you see virus being exploited, of course, by traditional disinformation actors. And here, of course, I have in mind pro-Kremlin ecosystem. But you unfortunately have also a lot of misinformation, basically unintentional spread of all kinds of conspiracies and falsehoods, especially on the online platforms. And a lot of it, unfortunately, are distributed without bad intentions, simply by the citizens. So we have essentially two big problems: disinformation and misinformation. And you have to have different policy responses to that. Now, the other big game changer, I would say, is that COVID is essentially really has an sort of disinformation around COVID has immediate impact on real life, So if you fall into conspiracies, about magic cures, about, the fact that corona maybe is just an ordinary flu and you don't need to take any precautions, it has like immediate impact on the health of the citizens, right? Same goes for narratives, like viruses spread by G5 network. It resulted in some European member states in destructions of telecommunication infrastructure. So that's another tricky thing. Now, what is our broad assessment? Like what we see? I think the picture is very complex, definitely. On one hand, you have Russian state media, pro-Kremlin ecosystem, which is, I would say, running more or less a coordinated campaign, targeting European Union, targeting also its neighborhood, amplifying very much the existing conspiracies around corona. I think objectives more or less kind of remain the same. So it's to undermine the government response to the crisis, to show that, let's say, European Union members are inefficient, have no capacity sort of to deal with the crisis, and all kind of doom and gloom scenarios, that EU solidarity is lacking, that Schengen area is falling apart, and so on and so on. The other sort of side of that coin is that there's a lot of messaging, basically, to say that, autocratic regimes are actually coping much better with the virus and with pandemic. You know, they're more efficient in reaction. They're saving the world. They're sending the masks and, you know, doctors around the globe and saving everybody. So that's unfortunately the other part of the coin. Now, I mean, we have a team here in Brussels, and there's a very good sort of website, EU versus Disinfo.eu, where we actually cataloged quite a lot of cases, close to 500 cases on COVID-related disinformation. So if you look at them, you will see a lot of cases that Volodymyr just mentioned, you know, that virus is a man-made, that it's probably produced, you know, in US biolabs around, you know, Russian borders or even in Asia. And then, of course, you have, you know, victims like Bill Gates or like George Soros, which are directly targeted. So, you know, this information definitely you can find more in our database. Now, in terms of Ukraine, I mean, what kind of trends we observe? And here I would say I would agree very much with Volodymyr. You know, there are quite a lot of disinformation narratives, you know, about imminent collapse of Ukraine, so that Ukraine will not be able to deal with the COVID. And then at the same side, you know, you have narratives saying that Ukraine actually is also leaving, let's say, Donbas behind, you know, so that Ukraine doesn't care about non-government controlled territories and are not helping them. So that's let's say the domestic narrative, but part of it is also targeting EU and Ukraine relations. Where basically, you know, we have a narrative that Ukraine is essentially abandoned by European allies, you know, who have their own problems, they have their own populations, and, you know, actually sort of nobody cares, you know, about our future relations. So that's, you know, that's basically also, again, an attempt to kind of to drive a wedge in our brilliant partnership. So I think that's maybe, you know, in short, in terms of the EU and in terms of EU level, definitely there are a lot of other actors out there, you know, who are using COVID, you know, China is using it for different purposes, maybe to promote its own governmental system, to deflect, you know, the blame and sort of defend its image abroad. But what I wanted to say that we also shouldn't rush, let's say, to take some radical measures to cope with disinformation and freedom of expression and media freedom has, you know, has to top our agenda in whatever response we have. So thank you very much for that. Over to you.
Thank you, Jurgis, for actually outlining some of the very interesting topics. And for example, that yes, indeed, coronavirus, it's the first virus we have, first pandemic in times of social media. And it's also what is the personal responsibility we have in spreading the information, but also in consuming it. So it's one is very interesting. Another issue is this, how authoritarian versus democracies are handling this pandemic. And you finalized with the radical measures. So how to fight disinformation, but not fight against freedom of speech. So this is our classical question, every time, evergreen question. And to answer this time, we would start our second part. Nadiia, we would like to know what Ukraine is doing in terms of fighting COVID-19 now, on both levels, government, non-governmental level. Nadiia, floor is yours.
Olena, thank you very much. I am very happy to be the part of, I would say, anti-coronavirus reaction. For example, why and how we know about what is going on in coronavirus field. We have weekly monitoring and also an interactive dashboard where we monitor almost 10,000 pieces of news every week. Can you please show the first slide? You can access it on topic radar text.org.ua. So this is our primary source of information about coronavirus disinfo. Of course, we are not the only ones, and I'm happy to be able to state that Ukrainian civic society, that Ukrainian government copes with coronavirus quite good, because everyone who had monitoring, everyone who did, for example, good spreading of truthful information, they switched to coronavirus, and it is a huge part not only in disinfo agenda, it is only a huge part in counter disinfo agenda and in good media. What you see now is the dynamics of key narratives of Russian disinformation we see in Ukraine, and of course the most prominent of them now is the first top left one, it's coronavirus. All the narratives that were mentioned today, for example, the collapse of Ukraine, the failed state, permanent economic crisis, etc., they now are turning around the coronavirus topic. But coronavirus disinformators did not have enough time to prepare, just as we were. So everyone came to the battle with the tools that were already in place. And we have anti-coronavirus fakes websites by behind the news, let us say. We have all the monitorings of NGOs, media monitorings now focusing on coronavirus as well. And I think this effort is worthwhile in fighting coronavirus. Also, I would like to mention that our government, surprisingly, it does quite well in communicating information about quarantine, about coronavirus situation. We have Telegram, Viber chats, we have president on the TV screen telling the key government messages about quarantine. Also, I would like to add to previous participants that the key messages of Russian disinformation about coronavirus are rather focused on what was spread before, such as failed state. And also they are very contradictory. We saw similar situation, for example, with MH17. There is narrative that there is no coronavirus and all the quarantine is just the sadistic effort of government to suffocate people. Can you please show the next slide? Thank you. Also, we see terrible things like Ukraine will face a famine and severe economic crisis. So we, for example, should stop export grains while it is a huge part of economics and there is no need to do this. Also, we can see that democratic discussions and some conflicts, reasonable conflicts with local authorities and central government, they're called separatism, etc. At the same time, disinformation in Russia for inner audience and external, they fail to communicate their crisis. So they are fine. Russian church, while a lot of their people were infected by virus, they still pretend to be helping to fight coronavirus. Pro-Russian politicians help to fight coronavirus, while in their words, Ukrainian authorities have failed. Ukrainian authorities did quite fine. It's everyone did mistakes, so they are okay. At the same time, they failed to react and they failed to impose quarantine. So whatever they do, they are failed. That's the main disinformation narrative, and it is very tailored to various groups. The reaction, it is present, and everyone who monitored and who fought disinformation before now turned their efforts to fight coronavirus disinfo, which is, in my opinion, is quite successful.
Thank you, Nadiia. And one precision question. On the governmental level, so you described, and what about non-governmental actors in fight of coronavirus? Can you share with us some initiatives, or maybe you know some examples.
Yes. We have already saw Internews. They do their monitoring, Detector Media, Ukrainian initiative, they monitor TV channels. We have a Facebook page Behind the News who debunk a lot of fakes, and they have coronavirus related website. We have VoxCheck. We have a super machine learning monitoring by text, the one I do, so I will PR it a bit. We have a lot of actually monitoring people who do monitoring, and all of them, IMI, Internews, Detector Media, Institute of Regional Press, Text, all of them now just act against coronavirus infodemia.
Thank you for this. And it's also worldwide what we know, that there's kind of some of unusual cooperations between companies, civil societies, opinion makers. It's not only Ukraine related, but elsewhere people are finding their ways how to contradict, because as Jurgis truly said, that the virus and disinformation gives direct impact on our lives, threatening the lives, not in metaphorical, but in a very physical way. And now I would like to give the floor to Tanel, speaking about the support of European Union to Ukraine in fights of coronavirus, disinformation, but also in general support in these difficult times. Tanel, the floor is yours. Oh.
Olena, good afternoon, colleagues. Happy to be part of this discussion on a very important topic. I think at the outset I should say that this is very much a cooperation between different actors. On the EU side, the support group for Ukraine, whom I represent, works very closely together with Jurgis and his team from EIS Stratcom task force. But of course, obviously, on the Ukrainian side, the civil society actors, media, and also government efforts are very important. I will run very quickly through the main 4 strands of the EU support in this area. I will start by civil society. Civil society is very important part of our support in general, and also as a part of it, support to societal resilience through strengthened engagement with journalists and fact checkers. In Ukraine, we have started a partnership with the local platform Stop Fake. Colleagues have mentioned some other platforms. Stop Fake is also a very known actor locally, and with the help of them, we will basically be providing support to broadcasting TV program countering fake news on COVID in Russian and in Ukrainian language all across Ukraine. Secondly, engagement with government is crucial, as it was already pointed out by other speakers. I'm very happy that we have stepped up our cooperation with the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who has a crucial role to play in the crisis communication, and we will provide them support, general communication support on their campaigns, but also we will facilitate the process of making EIS Stratcom content, what Jurgis was referring to, available in Ukrainian language and also adopted better into Ukrainian context. Third, support to freedom of expression and media freedom is very important general direction. What we do in the context of COVID-19 is obviously also very, very important. We will step up our work, particularly in eastern and southeastern parts of Ukraine. We will try to engage with the media channel that the government has launched for the Donbas region, and also trying to bring the messages to the other side of the contact line. Of course, being very much aware that this is a challenging task. And then as a follow-up to our action in the context of countering disinformation in the context of elections, we will step up media literacy activities in southeastern Ukraine. Finally, the fourth point, this is, of course, an interesting discussion, how Ukrainian audience perceives the EU support to Ukraine in the context of the crisis. Our view is that we have provided a very substantial package, altogether 190 million in different areas, emergency support, health systems, but also wider socio-economic resilience and development. Obviously, we are working very closely on the ground in Kiev in promoting this support through the active social media campaign and also TV and radio outreach. In terms of the speed, how this has been rolled out, I think that it has been quite of an extraordinary example. And what we have also seen locally from Ukraine is that the Ukrainian government has very much appreciated what we have done. And maybe a final point, I think I would very much like to agree what Jurgis said, that although the context is extraordinary, the reaction to this should be more stepping up and intensifying the existing efforts than to completely revolutionize what we have been doing so far. And we have lots of good examples here on the EU side and also there in Ukraine. I think it's more about the question how to tap in this in a coordinated fashion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tanel, for this, for outlining the support and cooperation in these difficult times. Now, Veronika, I will give the floor to you with the simple question. What can we learn from the member states in fighting against the COVID-19 disinformation? Veronika, floor is yours.
Thank you, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. I would like to start by saying that I guess it's kind of a common knowledge that the best way to deal with a crisis is to be prepared for it in advance. And unfortunately, I have to say that in many cases, when it comes to the EU member states, we can see that they have not been prepared in advance for this, especially when it comes to communication, fighting disinformation. There are some interesting and even inventive examples of countermeasures that have been taken, and I will go through some of them. However, it is important to know that many of them have been sort of made up on the go. They are not part of some kind of wider strategic framework for communication or crisis communication, and I think that's a real shame. And I am personally hoping that this whole situation will actually teach us something as well, and that it will be sort of a wake-up call for many European governments that they actually need these frameworks for their future. Another, I think, very important issue is that in this difficult time, many governments have been widely helped by civil society and also private sector. And without their assistance, I think that many of the measures wouldn't be that effective. So definitely, my thank you goes to all those initiatives that are trying to be helpful. In most of the EU member states, we have seen efforts to provide some kind of real-time factual information about the measures against the spread of the coronavirus, about the health risks. Most of the countries or governments have put up websites, dashboards with relevant information. In some cases, we have seen mobile applications with information or helplines. So this is basically the step number one that all the governments made. There have been some further efforts in some cases. For example, the United Kingdom established a rapid response team, which is based at the Cabinet Office, and the team is trying to identify and debunk disinformation proactively and also works with social media. I think that's one of the good examples where actually this issue is being taken seriously. There also have been less successful examples of trying to fight disinformation. The French government established a website called Disinformation, which sort of selected different news articles from other news sites and put them in one place, and it has been taken down after a while because of the complaint filed by the Journalistic Association because they were too selective in which media they included and which they did not. I think what this crisis also shows really well is the important role of public broadcasters. Quality public broadcasters play a huge role in various ways. Many of them started news programs for children with educational programs because many children have to stay at home and cannot go to school. Some public broadcasters started programs for the elderly population with a little bit more calm type of broadcasting. Some public broadcasters even started fact-checking task forces and specify their programs towards debunking myths, which I think is really, really interesting. In some countries, for example, in the Baltics, we have seen governments working with tech firms and IT experts, organizing hackathons, trying to find different tech solutions to their problems. We also see some governments using different types of channels for communicating with the public, like Viber or WhatsApp, creating different internal groups or even chatbots to provide information to people. Governments like Norway, for example, also tried to directly communicate with specific vulnerable parts of society. Specifically in Norway, there was a website created for children with information, even with like specific press conferences targeting children where the high political representatives were answering their questions. And for example, Finland also works with influencers, so they are trying to get the government authorized campaign towards younger population through YouTubers and other social media influencers, which I think is good. I would finalize this, however, by saying that most of these measures, once again, have really been sort of made up on the go, not part of some kind of larger framework. And also most of them are targeting only disinformation related to health risks, which are obviously the most important ones. But when it comes to disinformation produced by foreign actors like Russia or China, this has not really been on the main agenda, and most of these measures do not really tackle this problem in full. I guess it hasn't been as optimistic as it could have been, but I think there are some interesting ideas towards what kind of communication tools and channels can be used by governments to help in such a situation. And like I said, I really hope that this is going to serve as a bit of a wake-up call and that we are going to be better prepared next time, if there is a next time.
Oh yes, unfortunately, there is always a next time when we will have to be prepared. And this is one of the consequences of this COVID-19, so that we learn by doing and helpfully exchange these best practices. And thank you, Veronika, for bringing this. And by the way, dear speakers, we have been rewarded for our hard work to keep our speeches as short and precise as possible by very good questions. And we have now 20 minutes to engage with our audience. And I thank again the panelists, of course, for your speeches, but also to our participants. We are around 80 people now. So from around the globe, this is also the beauty of this online world. And I would really like to, we have more or less 5 to 6 questions. So I have selected some of the questions which are more common and those who are precisely addressed to particular to a particular speaker. So I would start from the first. I would say I would take first 3, and then hopefully we will have another round of the questions. So the first question is from Lena Surshko-Hunt. what has Zelensky, and I believe that it's probably to Volodymyr, to your question, what has the Zelensky administration done to address the revanchists and their messages? So when you were showing these messages on the screen, so what the authorities have done to address these messages, or to make it even harder, or his presidency emboldened them? So Volodymyr, this is the question to you. The next question is from Olga Chizhova, and I think it's probably to all panelists. If you had to make the checklist for a state, civil society, and media to effectively respond to COVID-19 related disinformation threats, what would you put on that list? If I may to rephrase, it's like, who are the champions within the state, civil society, and media to fight it more efficiently? So all of you who are ready to answer this question, please go ahead. And the third one is from Vladislav Maximov. The question, I will take one of your questions. A recent poll from Europeans at a project of Bertelsmann Stiftung Foundation found that an astounding 53% of young Europeans place more confidence in authoritarian states than democracies when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. Do you think this is an indirect impact of the authoritarian, and then this is the quote, authoritarian states are better at dealing with the virus narrative? Are we seeing a higher impact of disinformation narratives on younger citizens? This is a quite interesting question, really. In this discourse, democracies, authoritarian regimes who are fighting better, and what impact it all has in minds of the younger population. So I would give the floor. Who would like to start to address the questions? Volodymyr, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think I would address two of these three questions to leave more floor to other speakers. The first one is Zelensky embracing the revanchism. Well, partially yes, partially no, because Zelensky is a balancer. He's instinctively trying to get back to a usual style of Ukrainian politics of balancing between different forces. I would say that between pro-democratic and pro-Ukrainian forces and the forces that are coming from the post-Soviet time and post-communist elites. And this is a story coming from the 90s. So it's obviously, for me, it's a one step back from what we had since Euromaidan, but it's not yet a complete counter-revolution that it could have been. Remember that people, for example, if we take about law enforcement services, I think that revanchism in law enforcement services, in general prosecution, in police, in judiciary is much bigger, for example, than in other fields. And one of these revanchists is Kolomoisky and his people in the Servant of the People, the Zelensky's party. Coming to the third question about authoritarianism, I think this is one of the very interesting points. And it's difficult to answer the question who is better tackling the virus, the democracies or authoritarian states. Maybe China was successful in tackling it, but we don't know the whole story. But Russia is certainly not. If we take democratic states, well, Germany or Scandinavian countries are good, and maybe US is not. The question about the EU, it's also a big question. This is, during our recent discussion, it was a point raised by Applebaum that we don't see a clear-cut right now distinction. Well, we have the distinction, but the more important issue is how efficient and how much trust there is in societies. In Ukraine, well, the question, I don't think that authoritarian message is popular among the young audiences. I would say rather no. I would say that these pro-Russian messages are still more seductive to an older audience. But we see actors like Shari or somebody else who are definitely appealing to young audiences and saying that what we have now in Ukraine is not democratic enough, and there should be more democracy. But their democracy is very aggressive, very hate speech reach, etc. So I think we will have hybrid responses very soon in politics, and we are now having them. That's my take.
Thank you, Volodymyr. And Jurgis, would you address the question, some of the questions?
Yeah, I can take also a couple. I think in terms of the checklist, I mean, I leave, of course, for Veronika and Nadiia to fill up the checklist of responses. But I think for me, the social media platforms has to be sort of part of the checklist. You know, I think, you know, if you look at what is happening around COVID, misinformation and disinformation, platforms did quite a lot. I mean, even if you log into your Facebook, you know, or if you are on Google, you will immediately sort of get the references to authoritative sources, you know, that would provide you information on the virus. But nevertheless, I mean, there's definitely still a lack of transparency and accountability, you know, in terms of how the platforms deal with the threats. You know, what kind of especially transparency vis-a-vis algorithms they use to form, let's say, your newsfeed. So there's a lot of questions, and they have to be really the part of the response. If they are not, the measures that Veronika mentioned, you know, in terms of crisis management might not fully work, you know, because a lot of conversation between the citizens is taking now, you know, on the online field. In terms of democracies versus autocracies, you know, and what's the perception of youth or other people in terms of the efficiencies of these governance models? Tricky question. I mean, it's also a question on the impact, you know, of some of these narratives. I think we still miss much of the public opinion polling or focus groups in terms of how COVID changed, you know, some of the perceptions about things, you know, like democracy versus authoritarianism. I think, you know, some of these things naturally sort of appeal to the people, you know, if you have somebody who can take decisions very quickly, like in an authoritarian regime in a centralized way, probably it's very appealing. But if you look long term, and if you look like which are the countries that are really the most innovative and the most successful in the world, yeah, these are the ones, you know, who actually you know, protect freedom of expression and have democracies installed. So it's I think that's basically, I would agree, there's a little bit of wake-up call here to be very active on explaining and communicating our own agenda for the citizens, not giving, you know, space for the other guys to come up with conspiracies. So over to you.
Thank you, Jurgis. Is there anyone, does anyone want to tackle any of these questions, or shall we go? Yeah, Nadiia. We have another round of questions, so.
I see. First of all, about checklist. Veronika has been talking from a very more pessimistic but very realistic perspective that yes, there has to be some preparation in advance. For example, now we use what we had before. Everyone who did media monitoring and good journalism, they were very, very effective in the times of coronavirus. At the same time, government had to communicate as well. What is missing here is really a good media, trustworthy, and those who will show the real picture to the general public. About authoritarianism. I think the key issue is that they fail to tell the general audience about their fails and their crisis. They don't communicate it openly. And democratic societies who do communicate about crisis openly, they become this vulnerable. And it does not mean that we should not be vulnerable by not communicating the real situation. how to deal with it? Well, to tell about the real situation in the same Russia, where government, it seems like they put more efforts into propaganda than into the real response to coronavirus, with their convoys to Italy and the way our Russian church helps all the poor while being sick itself and spreading the virus. So it just needs a good journalism to inform people about what authoritarian regimes does not inform people about.
Thank you, Nadiia. Tanel, you would like to add something on the checklist, right?
Yes, just very shortly. I think 2 points. Media literacy is very important aspect. I think that we will address this issue in one of the other questions where there was a reference to misinformation. But I think that if we are ever to prepare a checklist, media literacy definitely has to be part of it. And then second point, maintaining the freedom of media, which I think Ukraine actually has done in a very, very good fashion. There have not been any real initiatives during the crisis, at least as far as I know, that would restrict freedom of media. Thank you.
This is very good to know, this reassuring statements. And I also saw that Nadiia was shaking her head, that confirming that we're okay, that COVID-19 at least has not been used or misused in imposing some anti-democratic practices. Veronika, shall we turn, do you have anything to add, or shall we turn to another round of questions?
I would just very quickly add that partly to the question about authoritarianism. So, I mean, I believe that this is a very multifaceted problem, why that many young people actually believe that authoritarian regimes deal with crises better. And I think it's obviously not true that nor Russia or China are dealing with the crisis better. I mean, if it wasn't for the lies that China spread at the very beginning about the spread of the virus, we might not have been in the situation that we are right now. But probably part of that is because there isn't actually that many information available out there about how those regimes work internally and what are the characteristics of these regimes. And partly it's also because the European or Western governments don't really have a well-thought strategy on how to promote themselves, basically to tell people why democracy is actually good for them. So I think those are two aspects that definitely shouldn't be omitted. And for the checklist, I mean, I really think that most of the measures can be divided into 3 groups. One is resilience building, that was already mentioned regarding media literacy, and basically education on all levels. But then again, we have to count with the fact that the fruits of building resilience will come in a couple of years, not right away. So it's not really crisis management. And then there is a lot of things that can be done and more short term, from building Stratcom networks and institutions that help raising awareness and training civil servants. But even when we talk about disinformation coming from foreign hostile actors like Russia or China, then we can also talk about sort of putting a cost on spreading those disinformation. So showing that we are not comfortable with this behavior and making it a little bit more difficult for those regimes to do so.
Thank you, Veronika. It was very good. I like your idea of the need to remind ourselves and not to take anything good or democracy for granted. And also, this is maybe another time why we need to remind ourselves. So shall we go for another round of questions? We still have 5 minutes, but maybe there's a couple of questions. Yes, there's a concrete question to Nadiia to share some great data science projects she has been talking about. Maybe we can do it somewhere in the chat or something. On topic radar, somehow the latest data is not shown for me, no corona. So it's some of these data science projects. Maybe
I will send it into chat. Okay.
Okay, this is good. There's another direct question to Jurgis. As you follow this from Dmytro Shkurko from Ukrinform, as you follow these disinformation trends, do you have an explanation in radical change in Russian propaganda from defending China from accusations of being a source of corona to de facto attacking China with the same blaming? Jurgis, would you? Shall I give you a little time to prepare, or you can?
No, I think the problem here is that I mean the question is very much valid, but you know we can only speculate what's happening, and I think we've seen that especially during the COVID times, the pro-Kremlin outlets actually sort of spread completely conflicting narratives at the same time, so it kind of, I would say, showed that when there is a stress in a way, some of the actors act in a decentralized way. On the other hand, I mean, I think the one of the feature, let's say, of pro-Kremlin ecosystem was to spread as many contradicting and confusing narratives and conspiracies out there. So I think it's nothing kind of surprising, that 1 week it's you go against somebody, and the next week you go you preach something totally different. I think what we recently saw, if we speak about Russia and China, is that on the narrative on the secret US biological laboratories on so-called former Soviet republics, I think there was quite a, let's say, quite a sort of cross-posting, or let's say amplification by what both Russian state actors and Chinese actors were saying. So both were helping each other to spread the same narrative about US biolabs. So that's definitely a very unfortunate and I would say worrying sign. Over to you.
Thank you. Did I unmute myself? Yes, I didn't mute myself. And you know what? As a contribution of our joint contribution to this fighting against disinformation, we have a question from Nelly Kirillova, and I thank you for this question. And I would address to all panelists, and let us do it like a blitz answer. So the question is the following, like very philosophical, but very correct in these times. How do you actually decide which information is correct and which is disinformation? And now she precises, for Ukraine internally, maybe you try to distinguish between falsified information in the interest of Russia or the West or the Ukrainian government. But in the world, which information do you consider as true and which do you consider as false regarding COVID-19? And also I would add to this, what are these measures? Let us help to all the participants to, what are your own indicators which helps you to say, no, this is false, or this I can trust. Blitz answers to all the panelists.
For us, we see, yes, it's a great question. We see not so much outright fakes, outright disinfo. We see malinformation and we see misinformation. What helps us, standards of journalism do help us. They are awesome. And if we see imbalanced picture, if we see that some facts are being mentioned, some are not, and the whole message is just it plays for Russia, then it is, and it's done by pro-Russian actor, then it's misinformation or malinformation, which is which does the same role as disinfo. If you have facts, why should you lie? Why not?
Okay, thank you. Tanel, you are next.
Maybe just a second. Yes, I'm online. Good. No, I think just to broaden from this a bit, I think for me, two things. First of all, which outlet is the producer of the content? Because in Ukraine, I think we can very clearly identify which media is Volodymyr referred earlier to Mr. Medvedchuk. If Mr. Medvedchuk's media produces something, you already have a certain lens that you have to look this news to. So I think this is very important. And then the second thing to me is the common sense. If something speaks strikingly against common sense, then there must be something wrong with this piece of information. Thanks.
Thank you. Who is next to give his insights? Yes, Volodymyr.
Yeah, I would very much agree with Nadiia and call for much more thorough distinctions. We can use this distinction of the Council of Europe between disinfo, malinformation, misinformation. I'm not happy with the concept of disinformation, frankly. I'm not happy with the concept of fake news because I think it's simplistic. But I think we are more and more entering the period of domination of malinformation, meaning that using any tools of information to harm. And I think this is the key criteria, the motivation of what is called disinformation behavior. So what is behind a certain behavior of people, even if they're trying to spread a part of truth, or if they're spreading facts, but with huge emotions, with huge hate speech or whatever. Is it the motivation to find the truth or motivation to harm others? And I think this, what is called the weaponization of information, this is the key concept behind it. It's not only about fakes or disinfo, it's mostly about using the information as a weapon. And I think this is the key distinction.
Thank you very much. Who is next?
Yeah, so I'm really not sure if this is the type of question that can be properly answered in a blitz. I don't want to repeat what was said before, but the truth really is that fact-checking process is quite complex and it looks at many levels. It doesn't only look specifically at content, it looks at journalistic standards, as Nadiia said, it looks at the ownership and the interests of the author or the source. It looks at the context that is or is not being provided, and it doesn't end at distinguishing this is true and this is false. We have to distinguish half-truths, we have to distinguish manipulation. We have to distinguish various interests. So I guess the key lies in providing enough context and enough information about what can be and cannot be trusted, and it also lies in having enough critical thinking so that people can eventually decide on their own while having sufficient and factual information.
Thank you. Jurgis?
Well, Veronika, I think stolen from my lips, you know, the two words critical thinking. I think it's key, you know. We shouldn't try to create, let's say, institution in our society, sort of ministry of truth will decide, you know, which will decide, you know, whether it's misinformation, disinformation. Definitely, I mean, there are people who should do fact checking, you know, but first of all, I mean, each of us individually should have, you know, the capacity to do at least a bit of that. And definitely, I mean, having, you know, disinformation as verifiably false does not really kind of, you know, do the circle, because we also have to look at the behavior behind some of these actors, you know, which are really manipulating and, as Volodymyr said, weaponizing information. So it's very tricky. I think we should, you know, the good recipe would be to prolong this webinar for another, you know, 6 or 7 hours, and maybe we would come up with some interesting discussion and terminology, but it's a very tricky question to answer. Thanks.
Thank you all. I would like to thank, so what I have taken from this, so it's again, we have amplified the need of our own work, applying common sense, applying critical thinking, and our own responsibility for consuming information and for spreading information, and how important it is in these difficult times. So I would like really to thank all the panelists for this work today. I would like to thank participants for your interesting question, for being with us today on this critical question, and I hope that some of our sharing of our insights will help you, has already helped and will help you in fighting misinformation, malinformation, and all kind of playing around with the information in the future. And I would like to thank our teams who were behind the scene, but nevertheless are as much as important as everyone who is on the screen, both our Yanas, Yana Weber, Yana Sayenka, and Alexander Turenka, who were helping in providing this webinar online. And on behalf of the Ukrainian think tank Liaison office in Brussels and Friedrich Naumann Foundation, we thank you for this webinar, and we will be happy to welcome you all at our new and next events. And the link how you can subscribe to the information about these events you can find in the chat as well. So, dear all, have a very good day and see you all next. Bye-bye.